Hello again. Um, I just thought I'd do another video. I've been struggling for topics though because I could go back into book commentaries, but I wanted to think about something a little bit more personal to me, but also hopefully vaguely philosophical as well, and cultural definitely. Um, the title I think is going to be East and West. Um, because I've spent a lot of time living in Asia, and I'm now living in Europe again, and I've had a lot of thoughts about the differences. So I thought I might give you a little bit of a personal journey about Asia today for those people who are thinking of moving there who are Western, uh, and also for people like me who are writers or more creative types. And yeah, hopefully you'll get a good summary of the feeling of being in Asia for long term. I first went to India in '99. I think I mentioned it in one of my immediately previous videos, recent videos. And I ended up, well, first of all, I went to India, but that was more of a, well, I knew when I would be back. I kind of had a journey planned out. What happened to me was I think I had 4 months or so of um, travel that I had planned. I had a flight booked to Mumbai, and then a further flight to Osaka, Japan, because I had a friend who was living in the Kansai area, vaguely near Osaka, in the middle of Japan. So I was going to spend some time with him, and then I had some months in India beforehand. I was 21. No, hold on. 23 at the time. Hold on a sec. Yes, so I was 23. Let me think. 20. No, 22, coming on 23, I think. It was January 99, and I remember even the date, actually, the 15th. For some reason, it's always stuck with me. 15th of January 99, yes, so I would be 22 and a half or something like that. I'd always been very fractious as a teenager, and I could have quite easily gone to a better uni, and I see it now as more of a progression of wanting to get as far away from the northwest of England as possible with whatever means necessary. So I got out as soon as I could in terms of going to university, but for me university was the background to just the notion of being outside of where you'd been brought up. So I'd done all that, and then India was the next step. I don't know why I was always fascinated by Asia, and I chose to go there on my own at the age of 22. I think it was a vaguely radical thing to do. I do remember when I was a child in primary school seeing the name of Kathmandu on one of those plastic world globes, and I thought, wow. I was always interested in maps, and I love looking at different maps, always, whether it's just of England or locally or world maps or certain mysterious places in the world that you didn't have much information about within your own kind of milieu or whatever. So I do remember that vaguely. I do remember the name Kathmandu. I didn't even think of it when I went to India. The irony being that I did end up in Kathmandu on that trip. It wasn't planned. So that was interesting, but that's probably worth a different video. What I just wanted to focus on today was, the working life and perhaps more personal aspects and the culture. But I will get back to Nepal and India. But anyway, I did spend a bit of time there. I was traveling a lot. I wouldn't say I learned that much about Indian culture and Nepal. It was very much just kind of like a studenty thing to do, and I had a little bit of money that I'd gathered up. Not a lot, I don't think, but it was enough for a few months in India. What did happen was that when I eventually got to Japan on the second leg of that same journey, and in the summer of '99, or maybe, yeah, it would be very, very early summer, I stayed with a friend who had a teaching job and ended up, it's not very unusual, I would imagine. I had a degree, as I mentioned, managed to get a job teaching English, so that would be the job offer came sometime in, I don't know, May, June '99 probably. And so I think I came home for a month or so that summer, and then my contract began in the August, if I remember correctly. So that was my first year planned out in Asia. First vaguely well-paid job. It was a good salary. The company was burgeoning because Japan had a great interest in English in the late 90s, and they had money to kind of back up that interest. So this place was like, I'd say, a franchise across Japan named Nova. If anybody was teaching around that era, they would probably know that name. There's about 3 or 4 big international schools, or what do they call them, ESL schools, that were kind of doing quite well at that time. I'm thinking Nova's been either absorbed into some other company or went bust, or I don't know what happened to it. I don't see it advertised anymore. Anyway, I did that for a year. I lived in Kobe in the Kansai area, as I mentioned. Kobe is a harbour town on the coast. It's about 45 minutes from Osaka. Osaka is a pretty massive city for those who don't know that area of Japan. It's, I would say at that time, I don't know, it could have been like 6-7 million people, not sure, maybe a bit less. Assuming every city's grown more in Japan, any major one. So, but it wasn't really a city atmosphere I was in. It was a kind of, Kobe is a nice, gentle, very welcoming Japanese town in the middle of Japan, along the coast, obviously. So it's got a harbour. At that time, what was interesting about Kobe was they'd had a massive earthquake. You'd have to check the timeline, but I would say it was probably only 3, 4, 5 years before I'd arrived, and lots of people had died as a result of that earthquake. So what was happening was, when I was starting teaching Japanese students, and within Nova they could have been all ages, they started telling me some stories, and it seemed that most people knew somebody who died or been seriously injured in the earthquake. So that was that, and I did some research on the earthquake later, and I took a more conspiratorial angle on it, but again, that's probably for another video. So that was my first dip into the waters of Asia, particularly like just work-wise, having a decent job, making a good salary, knowing that you were going to be there for a year. It turned out I ended up in Japan for 18 months, what were my first impressions? Well, I only really had India to compare, and I guess all analysis kind of deals in comparison. So, because I'd just been to India, anyone who's been to India would know that it's a bustling, competitive, largely poor, difficult country to travel around in some ways. It's vaguely friendly in some ways. I moved around a lot, so I met lots of people. So my interactions were more cursory. Like I said, I don't have any major takeout insights from India. But the thing was that it was not Japan at all, and that the Japanese were fairly insular, not given to great demonstrative personal gestures. In some ways it was the kind of opposite of India. Um, I've always thought Japan is the England of Asia and Korea is the Ireland of Asia, and I'll probably come back to that because I'll get on to talking about Korea later. That was the other place I lived. So again, I'm sure if I had a journal from the time, that there were lots of insights spilling out of me about the new situation I was in. But over time, when I look back at it just in an improvised way off the top of my head, I'm not actually very good at coming to judgment on a place. I tend to be more good on specifics. So Japan was, compared to England, it's probably more expensive to live at the time. The people were outgoing insofar as you could make friends through work fairly easily. Obviously, I didn't have a handle on Japanese. I learned about Japanese pretty quickly. I studied some Japanese the whole time I was there. I only ever got 2 scripts down, so anyone who knows that the Japanese have 3. I never got into the Chinese characters too much, so I had, sorry, did I say I had 2 scripts? I had partially the Chinese script, really basic stuff, and then I had the hiragana. I never got the katakana fully under my belt for like a basic reading skills. I could identify a few characters. All of it's kind of gone now, but I had the hiragana to read, and I had the katakana, some of it, to read. Obviously, understanding is a much more complex business because you'd have to be studying for years and years, particularly incorporating all of the other stuff. They call it kanji, the Chinese script. So that was that. I had a few inroads with the language. I had some English-speaking Japanese co-workers who I'd be, getting to know slowly but surely. I did have a lot of foreign teachers around me as well, because the school had something like 15 foreign teachers. They even had German and French teachers, so we'd have Germans and French in there as well, and we all mixed fairly freely in the teachers' room. It's not something that actually, in all my time teaching, and I've done a lot of teaching in Asia, I didn't really bump into Germans and French and other Europeans later on in the years that I was teaching. So that was kind of good in a way, because up until recently I've not really known Europe very well. I've been so long in Asia. So that was interesting. I was meeting loads of North Americans, Aussies, like I say, 2 or 3 European people, French, Germans. I was meeting some people who'd been in Japan quite a long time. I did notice when I compare the much longer time I spent in Korea of like something like 14, 15 years, the big difference for Japan in terms of its expat population within that kind of teaching sphere is that in Korea it's more North American, even more Canadian really. Didn't meet many Australians in Korea. Obviously, when I say Korea, I mean South Korea. That's the other thing. I'll come to Korea a bit more, but that's the other thing that you get a lot when you come back or when you've lived there a while and you refer to where you live. The media is such that everyone's emphasis is on North Korea because it's always got this threat status, in the news. So they want to kind of go, people who don't know anything about Korea or that, East Asia, they tend to go, you don't mean North Korea then. So their emphasis, they're always balancing those two things. I mean, if we're going to be strictly more political, it's just, I just say South Korea. I did for a while say, Daehanmin국, or the Republic of Korea, which is what South Koreans call their own country, or many South Koreans call their own country. But I'll come back to Korea in a bit. So anyway, I'll stick with the timeline for a while. So I did that. I spent some time in Osaka actually after I left Kobe. I'm just trying to think of takeout things that I could say about the Japanese. It's quite hard. The time has gone quite fast. What I liked about the country was that it was immensely clean. Everything ran on time. It was very kind of orderly. Again, India and even Britain to some extent is like not like that. In fact, I always wonder what the Japanese think when they're kind of bustling through England and France and places like that. I mean, I imagine Germany's a bit more efficient, but somebody at a railway station in Birmingham, who's Japanese must be immensely confused. So it's very orderly, very clean. I loved the fact that even though I didn't have Japanese, I could walk into a bookstore and I could pick up a number of books by Japanese people in translation. So even if I didn't have the language, for probably the whole time I was there, it wasn't like the internet wasn't blossoming, so you were still really dependent on bookstores. And in some ways, that was wonderful for Japan because you just had all these Japanese authors that you could read in translation. They had all the English translations in the bookshops. They were very kind of pro what their culture had produced in an international way. So that was good because you had a whole sense of post-war Japan coming out of fiction or short stories that you could read in English. So that was good, and it's kind of like Japanese. Well, I guess they've been liberalized, over the decades. I wouldn't have considered that when I was there so much. Very obsessive about Western culture, and I felt very keyed into us being from the West and them sussing me out as from the West and being interested in me culturally on a very kind of studied level. Like you can find all kinds of obscure, very geeky, wonderful pieces of obscure Western culture kind of implanted into Japan. They're really, you wouldn't expect to find John Coltrane. Maybe you wouldn't, but I guess we've all got that Japanese import CD thing going on. So you've got all these kind of crazy jazz CDs and really obscure bands. I remember finding all kinds of interesting music, Western music, in Japan, in like market stalls or arcades and stuff like that. And I really felt that they were tuned into the West in a way. They'd created their own version of the West, which is kind of what every Far Eastern country probably does in some way. Well, to an extent, and I'll get on to Korea in a bit. But that was interesting that they had that much interest in Western culture. When I look at it though, there's a there's a disability in that too, that traditionalism in Japan had been lost with, say, somebody like Yukio Mishima, who was much more nationalistic. And I studied Mishima a lot, and that was something I got from being in Japan. I studied another author called Osamu Dazai, uh, and Dazai was really French existentialism transplanted into Japan, which was kind of interesting. Both good writers, but Mishima particularly. I studied the life of Mishima. I really got into that aspect of the country. This was kind of before people like Murakami and certain other authors became popular, or they weren't really on my radar as much. I've read a couple of Murakami books, but there was something about Mishima that I always loved. He's much more right wing from a 21st century, perspective, Western perspective. But I read a lot of his books. I thought they were really interesting. I thought he was a great man in some ways, and that the great man ethos, the Thomas Carlyle kind of hero worship aspect of the Western man, that had disappeared really in the 19th century, was still there with somebody like Mishima in the 20th century, for that part of the world anyway. I thought that was really interesting. I'm very, very familiar with Mishima. I don't know, that was one thing that I just picked up on straight away, and it's never left me. Because in some ways I am kind of interested in nationalism, and definitely, I feel that's what that's what England has lost. I mean, supremely lost, and we just have no notion of what we are as a culture, and we're going to have to revive that, or suffer, cultural death, as far as I can tell. I'll go into that in another video. So I thought that was good, and I think that there are certain aspects between even Ireland and Japan, possibly. The kind of ancient warriordom that you might imagine in a fictional ancient island was still tapped into with something like the samurai tradition in a weird way. I mean, that was another article I haven't got around to writing for The Fiend, the magazine I had. Was, I think I had an idea like Mishima among the Druids or something. I felt that there was some world tradition that Ireland and England, modern Ireland and England, had lost, and that Japan had lost similarly, but only very, very recently. And you could analyze how that had happened with industrialization or whatever. Industrialization had begun a hell of a lot earlier in Japan than it has in South Korea, which is my other kind of reference point. So yeah, I really loved the literary tradition of Japan, and I tried to read everything I could in translation. If I couldn't get it in the country, then I think it was kind of Amazon period, so that you could order things and have them sent. So I did have quite a library of Japanese literature for a while. So that was great. My sense of the people, kind, considerate, aware of schedules. You don't want to be late, stuff like that. Everything's very efficient. It's just very orderly and efficient. Now that's a psychological observation, but it's also like the cultural, the physical layout of a place is just kind of like, it's just like that. And there's so much that's so distinct about Japanese culture that you can't help having respect for it. There's a weird dark underbelly of Japanese culture, which is more kind of like a sexual thing. Um, I had some Western girl I spoke to at the time had said she'd seen a guy masturbating in public near a train station or something in Japan. See, that's something that wouldn't happen in England, you know. Um, and then you got all the kind of manga porn, or for fans of manga, you know, I'm trying to put these things in categories because this is not like manga's all porn or something, but it's got that, and they're quite you know, there's a long history of erotic art as well in Japan. I mean, some of it's really cool. So there's that element of it, but there's also kind of like a seediness sometimes about Japan, and you get that whole thing of like you know, businessmen rubbing themselves up against girls on the subway and stuff like that. Um, that was weird, and it didn't really go away with Korea, but Korea was a little bit different. But yeah, there's that kind of element which was less, you know, I was less enamored of that. So it was interesting, but I can't put my finger on very very specific things. Also, something else that happened while I was there was oh, that's the other thing about Japanese culture. It's very extremes. There's a lot of extremes. You know, people are very orderly, and they present themselves well, and they speak well. You know, in the language that they have in English or in their own language. It's very orderly. The social mask is really kind of important. Um, so that was interesting, but I think as a consequence, the the more negative side, you know, you don't get petty crime in Japan. You get like you know, serial murder. It, that's what I'm getting at. It's like it's very extreme. It's like killers on the rampage, but then everything's orderly in your social sphere, generally speaking. So that's weird and interesting about Japan. Um, you know, America must be well, maybe the media is affecting me too much, but you know, like America is like the place of petty crime. It's like it's just, you know, I'm gonna steal this, I'm gonna steal that. This thing will do. You know, it's like it's a vaguely lawless. It seems like a vaguely lawless place sometimes, but I'm qualifying that heavily because you know the Brits are so conceited usually about America. Because I'm kind of pro gun laws and the existence of guns and the use of them if necessary for security and all that. I don't have a problem with that, but I would have had a problem with that, you know, at the time that I'm talking about. But yeah, it seems a bit of a lawless place. Japan is very orderly, but there's these undercurrents which are very dark. You know what I mean? And of course, they've got all the yakuza thing going on as well. I actually lived 2 blocks in front of a very big, very well-known yakuza figure in Kobe, and I think Osaka and that part of Japan has quite a presence of yakuza. I don't think I've ever met anybody. I dated somebody whose father was possibly a member of an American form of the Yakuza. Unbeknownst to me for a long time. I think I was told at some point. But anyway, I've never had any dealings with gangsters or anything like that. I don't really agree with that kind of ethos. I think would agree if the government was totally out of control. Maybe, I don't know. I believe in kind of familial lines of rule, hopefully peaceful, but you know, the human psyche is just so incontrovertibly insane that neither gangsters or government will fit the bill, as far as I can tell. In terms of, you know, ordering society, although I'd like to make some videos on how structurally we could order our cultures a lot more effectively. Gangsters, yeah. So apart from that, I don't know much about gangsters, but there's definitely stuff going on, and there's a big game in Kansai called Pachinko, I think, if I remember correctly, and most of that is Yakuza funded, or at least it was at that time. So they have lots of ways of making bits of dollops of cash here and there, and they use that cash for good or ill. I would imagine mostly ill, but I couldn't. I'd have to do an analysis of the specifics of some kind of political scenario. So there's that. How the hell did I get onto that? Anyway, there's that as well. Um, but I'm going to make some greater judgments later on. But I will say that that kind of overt masculine sexual dominance, the kind of feeling women up on the train and stuff like that, it's really it really gets on my nerves. It's like, I'm assuming you wouldn't have that in England or in the West. I just think there's this sense whereby the woman is still a little bit put upon, and there isn't as much balance between. I think there's a great balance, actually. They say feminism is there to correct the balance. So I don't really believe in feminism, but I will say that we've actually got it right, between the genders in the West, generally speaking, when it comes to like job opportunities, and the way that people treat women in the West is pretty damn good compared to some of the places I've lived. I'm not sure why, the newer feminists have got so much to complain about, to be honest. I think women are outscoring men in university now. I don't know if that's because of the opportunities for study they've been given, or men at the moment are particularly stupid or something. I doubt it. I think there's always a vague balance there, at least within white culture, if you will. So yeah, I didn't, but that's something I reflect on more than I really questioned at the time, probably. And I've talked to other people who've lived in Japan for a while since, perhaps those observations came out of that rather than something I observed at the time, and then stories that people had told me. I think out of Mishima and my sense of Mishima and my study of Mishima, down the years after I lived in Japan, I would say that it's on the slide. It's been on the slide since at least since the Second World War, and obviously atrocities. You learn the other balance that you have to make is living in Korea, right? Because Japan had colonized Korea for much of the 20th century. So I've got the two sides. This was my immersion in East Asia for the first time, but then later on I was going to get a lot more stories of the Japanese as horrific oppressors. So, but I didn't know that at the time, so I'll get into that in a bit. So back to the timeline. I had a period. So I'm living in Japan for about 18 months. I did go back to India for a few months in between legs, like periods of stay. I think I was in for a year, went back to India, I think, and then was back in Osaka for 6 months. I really left Japan because I wasn't finding the kind of work that I wanted to do, and I realised actually I did the year with Nova, and it's quite a lot of work probably compared to what I'm used to now, but it was actually good. I left because I wanted to explore other things in terms of teaching, but actually that was probably one of the better contracts I've had in my teaching career, if you want. So I had a period where I was looking for work, and I had 2 part-time jobs when I was in Osaka, just about surviving financially. One was in a little mom and pop school, and what can I say? I think the other one was I had a few private students, and the other one was a college in just south side of Osaka. Um, but it was all a bit of juggling finances. I hadn't done that, I was still very young. And I just had a lot on my plate, and it would have been nice to have had one or two contracts which were much more low key. And living in Osaka was expensive, and I was probably only just getting by in that last 6 months. The first year, I think I had a much better salary. Of course, nobody had trained me to look after my money, so I probably spent far too much. But that was that. There wasn't any big reason why I left Japan. I can't think of anything offhand now. Just that I would have much more appreciated like one job or one contract with a decent salary, and just kind of hopefully functioned in that way. At the time, I also wanted to do a couple of other things. I had a bit of a trip to Canada that I wanted to do, which I ended up doing. But anyway, long story short, I left Japan in 2000, the end of 2001, and by the spring of 2003 I was back in Asia. There's a period in between which I could go into in another video perhaps, but anyway, I'm back in South Korea. I'd found an ad while I was living in London in 2002 or 3. No, it would be early 2003. More teaching work. I'd been doing some real kind of Joe jobs in London, so that was the thing that propelled me to move to Asia again in 2003, and this time to southwest big city in South Korea called Gwangju, not to be confused with the Chinese Guangzhou apparently. So I ended up there in possibly March of 2003-ish. I don't remember beyond that. It was a mom and pop situation, and immediately the cultural differences between Japan and Korea, because I'd gone to Korea with Japan as my only reference point for that part of the world, and those countries cannot be more different in many ways. Like I said, I'll kind of justify that generalization I made earlier, that Japan is the England of East Asia and Korea is the island of East Asia, because it seems to me that people are just friendly, super friendly, and but different, but still Asian. They've got their own thing going on there. But you had to be careful because you're young, and you're basically in a culture that's quite gregarious. I mean, obviously there's nervousness around a foreigner. You look different, totally different, as I did in Japan, but they're not the Japanese. You can wander up to somebody and talk to people, and it's very gregarious. And people do you lots of favors. They'll help you out if they can. They don't really have any money. Although nowadays Korea's come up in the world economically supposedly a lot better than it was in 2003, to be honest. But Korea's always had that strain of the super rich, so it tends to be divided. It's like the super rich, pretty rich, and then everyone else is just kind of month to month. It's an odd mixture, you know what I mean? And so most people don't have that much. As a consequence, you get a lot of stuff going on that you wouldn't understand if you just came from the West initially. So, for example, contracts are very floppy, I would say. Promises are very vague. These people are often struggling financially, and they think that if they get a white face in there wandering around the room and speaking brilliant Americanese, hopefully, or something like that, that's their emphasis, because their thing of Western culture is not like Japan. It's very fragmented. It does not seem as nuanced at all. Although it is gregarious and friendly towards Westerners, it's not nuanced. It's like these people think that the West is basically Disneyland. It's like it's like the worst aspects of American culture. So that's a constant, right? I mean, that will wear you down as a European. Brit, and again, there are many reasons why this view of the West in Korea is so, anti-intellectual or just not analytical. It's just pieces from Hollywood, pieces from sports and current events. The media does play quite a lot of, the US on that side has always been so pervasive everywhere as the years go by that was inevitable to some degree. But in Japan, at least at the turn of the century, it was nuanced. And the thing that frustrated me about Korea was that, and it could be a criticism of Ireland too, is that this culture of, it's a hard word to say, but it's a victimhood culture, because they've come out of colonialism, Japanese colonialism, and the Korean War, and I think that's a topic that I could talk of a lot in cultural terms, because I just think that there's another quote here, and it involves Sinead O'Connor said this in one of her songs or in an interview. It takes 100 years. She says something about if people are slaughtered in a country, it takes a certain amount of time, centuries possibly, for them to psychologically recover from that. And this is where I'll be a lot more analytical and come to hopefully some conclusions. Koreans, at least in the South, I can't speak for the North. I could make some reflections on the North, but I'll do that later. Are not brain dead, brain damaged people. They're damaged people. They're damaged. They're like children, like a bit. And this is again, I think Sinead O'Connor has talked about this in terms of Ireland. They are gregarious people with the child instinct, the child's instincts in many ways. They want to discover things. They're very romantic. The romantic gesture and romantic opportunities and inclinations and talking about that side of life. They love that because they feel like social connection is the thing, and that wisdom often comes out of social advancement and social connection. And they've had a horrific past. I mean, I don't want to take the island Korea thing too far, because there are differences, and I don't want to be accused of generalization. But people were in the late 50s, 60s, even into the 70s in South Korea, the people were actually eating their children to stay alive in some cases. People were suicidal. It was a horrific aftermath, the Korean War. I mean, the Korean War was horrific anyway, because we have, 2 million people slaughtered, and slaughtering each other, but with a lot of international help. And I do have some conspiratorial views on the recent history of South Korea as well. But the burden, the psychological burden of that time and that specific conflict is still all over them. They are incredibly loyal to you, but if you cross them, then they want to rip your heart out, because they're children and they don't have a mature level of dealing with these connections. The problem also is they have the Confucian elder thing going on, right? So orders come down from above, the father, the mother, the grandfather. I mean, the South Korean guy who's in his 80s, right? Whether he is the stupidest man on earth will be given respect when you sit down for a meal with, say, 10 Koreans. I mean, that is the way it is. There are some good points on respect for elders, and it's coming out of, I'm assuming, my sense of the concept and the philosophy of respect for elders to this degree is coming out of Confucius, but they refer to him as Kongja. But it's incredibly satisfying in some ways because we don't do it enough with our own elderly in England and in the West. But in other ways, it's totally stifling. Like somebody in their 20s and 30s in the West is obviously massively affected by the interests and intrigues of their parents and what they want their children to do with their life and what they don't want them to do with their life. That's clear, but to a much higher degree. I mean, if you meet somebody who's 24, 25 in South Korea, they really don't have anything of their own identity. Most of them, as far as I can tell, they are pretty much just walking mouthpieces for their parents' views, and also desperately trying to achieve what their parents expect of them. I'll just turn the light on, hold on. So that's interesting, and in many ways it's one of the things I got tired of the most. The other problem, and this is similar to Japan in a way, is that there's no William Blake in South Korea, and that's a blanket statement, so I'll have to qualify that. The imagination, the imaginative arts, I think, is such a wonderfully Western thing, which we don't acknowledge about ourselves, almost not at all. I don't have to speak about William Blake. I could say Dante Alighieri or William Shakespeare or something like that. And Mishima to me is a great writer, but these people that I mentioned, I do feel a certain amount of cultural superiority. I hate to say it, but and I have these things in balance. I feel more now. You know, when you're in your early 20s, you're just rushing at things, going through them and saying, this is wonderful, England must be awful, and that's more to do with white flight, and we didn't really cognize what that was, you know, in the 90s. But society had been constructed so that it was very difficult as a teacher, if you wanted to purely teach, you know, the opportunity was to travel and teach. And it's gotten worse now, and I want to I'll either make a video on that or I'll speak more about that later. So you're kind of respecting everything a lot when you're in that world, in that country, and I guess we all do. If we're in England, we have this general respect for what people do in that culture, even if it's utterly insane, and often it is. That's the social being, you know, that people have. But now I look back and I can weigh things up a little bit more. So what I got tired of the most was this respect for the elders when it was not warranted. You know, that I liked the fact that Western culture had some different sense of the individual, and that the individual was pretty complex and could be absorbed into the group to a degree, but the innovative elements would not be absorbed, and that they would be quite stubbornly and joyfully respecting their own opinions and keeping distant from the majority. South Korea has nothing like that. Modern South Korea, it's a groupthink, and I think that's another reason why I didn't. I mean, I had some Korean friends, possibly a few more than the average Westerner teaching in Western situations has, but that was what I found stifling the most, was that I had a couple of good friends that I saw regularly, but apart from that, I found social life utterly stifling because of this lack of imaginative thought. and I'd like to think it was just something that doesn't come across in translation or something. I learned Korean to a basic degree. I could chat, I could get through my day, and I could get through certain little complexities of basic conversation, likes, dislikes, vague, good vocab, at least for that level. But that was the thing I never really found. Perhaps I was just meeting the wrong people. Was that they were not artistically minded. I find that when I talk to the average Westerner, even if they're not like super plugged into the, the Matrix is this, or conspiracy, or up to date on whatever has happened on YouTube recently, they live their lives in a vaguely creative way, particularly if they have their own business. And I really respect people who have their own business, perhaps more than artists even. But there's this sense of creativity. I'm gonna create something for myself. What tends to happen with business? Then there's loads of small businesses in South Korea, by the way. There's loads more business than there is in England, which is a great thing. But the problem is the uniformity of business, the lack of creative thought. I mean, if you take a strip of restaurants in a busy city in South Korea, you'll notice a trend, and it's very specific everywhere you go. So it's kind of like a guy set up a coffee stand there, and coffee's gotten massive in Korea. It wasn't like that when I got there, but what I'm getting at is that within 10 years, all the places around there is like the same coffee place, because one guy saw it and went, that might make me money. But they didn't think of it in anything more of a nuanced way than that. So I feel that there's some kind of lack of creativity and lack of innovation when it comes to business. And almost I don't think, very rarely in my teaching days did I ever talk to anybody about art, ever. I mean, I once did a lesson on surrealism. Could you believe it? I think it was only one lesson. And that really shocked and disturbed some of those students that saw that. They really saw no redeeming aspect in it, or even just to come to a judgment that it's shit was beyond them. Like, it was just imaginative thought. And maybe there are people watching this still like surrealism, but still they can put the finger on it and go, I don't like that, that's a bunch of shit. But this was like, it was just an invasion of the way that they went about their daily lives. The imaginative thought just seems mostly absent from Korean life. And so I had to adapt to that, which was hard. To be honest, I wasn't aware of it. When you're trying to kind of build a career, perhaps, and I was in a relationship long time while I was in South Korea. So when you're building a life for yourself, that's pretty financially concrete, emotionally stable, hopefully, linguistically elaborated. You're studying the language at least to a degree where you can talk to as many people as you'd like to. All of that, you do have a loss. I'm sure other expats talk about this. You have a loss of your own identity, whatever you may have thought that was, if you're British or wherever you're from, and you sometimes grieve for that part of you that has been sublimated. I wouldn't say you've cut it out of your life, but it's a different thing. You don't present it. I mean, like I said, because of that prevalent sense of the North American being the foreigner, or at least the white foreigner, the English speaker. It was such a prevalent thing that being from the north of England, I mean, we don't get a look in. I mean, we really don't. We're kind of sublimated, so we speak English, so there's that kind of fascination with us. But culturally, that's the other reason why I had to leave eventually, was that the problem with this was more of a problem with teaching than a problem with South Korea. But the problem is that you're basically teaching an identikit formula for English language study, which doesn't involve anything of your own culture. And to me, I grew to believe that culture and language are so inseparable that if you try to create a language that is just, a language to teach that conforms to certain stereotypes of America or the West, the really ridiculous stereotypes, that you're going to suffer a kind of death in yourself, because you're not presenting who you are culturally to anybody, because then they're just not interested. Or they might be, but the tools that you have in front of you to create the average lesson won't allow for that to come out very much. It always does to a degree, because you never escape, that cultural upbringing. But it's not there. It's not there. It's not present very much. So, and I never feel uncomfortable anywhere I go in Europe with that. I like Europe for that. I loathe Europe for its governments, mostly. But there's that sense, and this is maybe just the problem of living across the world from where you were born. I mean, it's going to be a tough thing. I do know it's not all bad. I do know people who adjust and learn the language in a very thorough way. I could never even say I did that. They're invested. They have relationships with Asian women. Usually, that's another interesting topic. The gender thing is interesting. Asian women go for Western men. Asian men, Western women. No, that's interesting. There's very few. There's less. I mean, it does happen. Why is that? That's kind of interesting too. Anyway, maybe I'll talk about the genders in Asia in another video. So there's that stuff going on. You get a bit lazy because there is that immediate fascination, but it's not a long-term fascination. Trust me, folks, if you're planning to go there, you're not going to be king of the hill in everybody's address book for very long, because they are Koreans and they're not that interested in the West, most of them, unless they're studying something or they have a certain area of research. And also you've got to remember that they're studying English not because of you or because of the culture or any of that. They are studying English because they want a job in their own culture, right? So that's very important to think about as well. There is a culture of officialdom which presents itself to you as if these people really give a toss about you and your culture and your language. You soon get over that. Within 5 years, you're over that hump, and you know that it's all fake, and that most people couldn't give a toss about English at all. And then culture is even lower down on their list of interests. I hate to say that, but that's the majority viewpoint. They would never say it to your face, most probably. I lived in South Korea. Well, I was connected and lived in South Korea for 14 years. A couple of those years was spent in the northwest of England, but the rest of the time I was in South Korea, and I had a period when I don't think I left the country for 5 years. At least didn't go to the West. I may have gone to China. No, I don't know. I don't even know. I think there was a period after the 2010s, that I may not have left the country for a long, long time. So I was kind of immersed in it. So what else can I say? I want to get back to some of those historical observations I made. It's all about bettering yourself, and it's really quite nice when you first go, because people put in the hours, and Westerners seem vaguely lazy compared to Asians, particularly Koreans. Koreans have this sense that they've got to get things done, and they've got to do 14, 15-hour days in school. And a lot of the kids hate it, and it's on red alert in terms of achievement, South Korea, always. And not to its own psychic betterment a lot of the time, because of course people just fall asleep or get stressed out. Stress is just, there's more stress in South Korea than anywhere I've been to in the West. It's that barrier again with the Korean War. Horrific things have happened. You have to get back on your feet, and you're going to work your way out of it. You've convinced yourself that you're just going to make shitloads of money, and you're going to get out of it. It's bullshit. It's all crap. Bullshit. Anti-spiritual behavior. But that's what the culture is convinced that it can achieve. It won't, and it's the West's late 19th century, early 20th century is Korea's early 21st century. So spiritualism came back big time, it seems to me, in the West, for good or ill, because a lot of it was fake spirituality, with the 60s and the 70s or whatever. But I would say there could be some genuine underpinning to that. Westerners decided, or at least fought through to the idea that 9 to 5 work and that kind of thing was one form of life, but it was one of many. Koreans have not discovered that yet, and probably won't do for a good while longer. China similarly. So what you're left with is people who are totally ensconced in the money game, and have almost no spirituality whatsoever. Now, I want to qualify the last statement, because you see temples, you see places where people go to worship. There's a mixture of Christians and Buddhists in South Korea. Christians in the minority, Buddhists in the majority, but they don't really talk to you too much about their religious feelings or philosophical tenets, because most of them don't have any spiritual feelings whatsoever, as far as I can tell. I watched a documentary once, I think it was in Korean, and I understood a lot of it, but I did have to talk to my partner about it as well. And what was interesting was it was a documentary about the temples in Korea, and what actually seems closer to the truth. You like to think there are a lot of holy men doing good things and coming up with jewels of wisdom, comparable with Lao Tzu or all these sages. But the truth, at least for South Korea, is that it's the lowest people that need protection. That people with mental health issues and stuff like that end up as the equivalent to nuns in temples or priests, and not all of that is the case, but essentially it's the people that cannot deal with the stress and the strain of material exasperation, which is modern South Korea. So these people are often kind of like refugees of that psyche. So it's not all roses when it comes to Korean spirituality. It's a cut and thrust business, and mostly government sponsored business. I know this is going to sound terribly critical, but I was hard pressed to find any spiritual or philosophical anchoring amongst most people. Having said that, I can say the same thing for the English or the British as well, and the Irish. This is funny because I've said in my intro that I'm proud of my Irish lineage, but I'm not. I'm not at all proud of modern Ireland. I take James Joyce's stance that it's utterly corrupt and, for the most part, useless and governed uselessly and all the rest of it. But anyway, yeah, back to Korean spirituality. It's just absent. There were corners of the culture which fascinated me. The fact that people, certain older men, for example, would still wear traditional Korean clothes in public. Just now and then you'd see them. They'd be wearing proper old style clothes from pre Second World War. So there was that sense that those were the individuals, and they wouldn't, unless you had your Korean down good, you're not gonna chat to these people, right? So there was a traditionalism that you sense was lost. It's still a hell of a lot more traditional than Britain. Gender alignment is Japanese style, but worse. It's super patriarchal. It has to be said, loads of domestic violence, a lot of alcohol abuse in South Korea. Men don't know how to treat women. They're children. They are psychologically damaged children, Korean men. I mean, I don't know. And some of the best Korean men I know who are my friends would say the same thing of Korean men. I think they're utterly useless, most of them. But it's forgivable, especially with the young. Just brutal. And in a brutal financial situation, usually a lot of debt, a lot of Kim Dae-jung, one of the presidents before the turn of the century, introduced the credit system, which we were already introduced to in the West a couple of decades earlier, or at least a decade. So they're just in over their heads financially. They're not economic thinkers, They're just children that have got a lot of issues, and they don't know how to run their economic lives. Almost no clue, most of them. So there's that. What there is that there's little lending. There's little co-ops that people actually join between them, independent of banks, to kind of try to sort out some of their communal issues, and that's a good thing. The instinct is good. I don't know what the outcome of those particular endeavours are, but we don't have that instinct at all in England. We should, if we want to undermine the major banks in the West, or at least, in my experience in my own country, in England. So there's the economics of the thing as well. Yeah, they're in over their heads. They've not studied the wonderful thing about that dialogue between East and West is that the West is the East's future, particularly South Korea's future. So if they got to grips with the real West, they could see what's coming down the pipeline for them, and most of it is ugly. Most of it is ugly and horrific. Bigger and bigger government, more and more control. Small businesses, very few, not burgeoning, and we know what's happened this year. So, and they just buy the Hollywood version, I guess, or at least a number of them do. I mean, let's be honest, there's always going to be a number of Koreans that you don't speak to who are cool people. You don't get that information. Maybe they're very intelligent, but if they want to learn about the future of their country, then they need to study the West in a very brutal and analytical and discerning manner. And if they do that, then they might be able to avoid some of the awful things that have happened to Europe over the last 2-3 decades, let's say. But I don't know if that will happen. I have no idea. I mean, by the end I was getting quite frustrated with the whole thing. I mean, to the point where I didn't I rarely socialised, at all. I mean, months would go by and I wouldn't speak to anybody but my partner and a couple of friends, maybe. So yes, that's the bad news, and it does. And to go back to the historical, view of the thing, that's what happens when you lose loved ones like that, or you lose whole families like that. When you have a culture that's split down the middle, and all the rest of it, is that the psychic wounds are just so deep. It will. I mean, I don't know what Sinead said, but I don't know. It's like 200 years, I mean, Ireland, if you take the classic example of 900 years of colonialism, what kind of damage is there in Ireland that has to be healed? Um, and I don't like the kind of base level Irishman who would just blame everything on the Brits. The Brits refers to a bunch of people living in a place. Now, a lot of those people are stupid and ill-informed, and are harmful to the rights. Not let's not say rights, but the welfare of the average Irish person. But in a benign way, forgivable. They don't have the right information in front of them, right? I would say that the great enemy of a united Ireland would be the government of Britain, or the monarchy of Britain, if you wanted to point fingers. And I will talk about that in another video. But in the same way in South Korea, is that they've had such shitty government and such horrific colonial problems over the 20th century. Now that is the soup that you're going to be living in if you choose to be a teacher in 2020 in South Korea. And it's up to you. I didn't make this video with people who want to teach in mind necessarily. And I have watched a lot of videos of foreigners, particularly Americans, talking about their time in South Korea. And not much of it impresses me, really. People get fixated on all kinds of little things, like they eat this way, or it's like I don't really focus too much on that. I'm talking about like big philosophical tenets that are either useful or not useful to a culture, and what is going to be the form of psychological self-harm, if certain attitudes are not gotten over in the culture. That's what interests me a bit more. I might roll a cigarette while I'm making this. So, how would I conclude? It's a tough one. Having said all of that, I like South Korea more than Japan. And not because I like to side with the underdog, but I lived there a long time. I know it a lot better. I'd love to meet somebody who'd spent 15 years in Japan and a couple of years in Korea, so they know a bit about South Korea, but they have the Japanese angle long term. I mean, I do know people who still live there. I mean, I have people I've known who are still in Japan, but I'm not in touch with them now, so that dialogue can't happen. So that's kind of interesting. Why do I like it? And why would I recommend it over Japan? It's something that I haven't put my finger on yet in this video. It is the charm. Something to do with the charm of the people and the humility. And it makes me, I mean, I'm not going to hopefully weep on camera, but there's something deep in the Korean people which is beautiful and noble, but it's not flowering as it should be right now, and it's encumbered by all kinds of damage. And I would like for Koreans to respect themselves more. For example, there's too many sorries in your culture, Koreans. 최소합니다, they say. Too many sorries. You need to have a bit more self-respect than that. And you could say the same for the Irish, I guess. But no, I wouldn't say. That's a different situation, and I don't want to generalize. Yeah, respect yourselves more, study a little bit less, enjoy yourselves. I'm not sure you know how to yet. I'm serious. I'm not sure you know how to enjoy yourselves yet. So strict as you are with your goals and your life plans of making millions. So there's that. But I think it's worth your visiting or perhaps working short term. I want to make a video on teaching abroad. For now, all I want to say is that it's a fool's errand. See, I'm generalizing wildly again. But I think most ESL teaching is a fool's errand, and I want to be quite provocative about that, because there's so many people leaving their own cultures in the West and going to Asia, and I want people, good people who can teach well. I hate to say it, I want them to be in their own culture, thriving in their own culture. And I think we can always have the people who want to be adventurous through the next century and travel and teach and do whatever they want to do abroad. That's great. But I think, we've got to kind of measure out this thing correctly, because we don't talk about immigrancy enough, but we are in Britain, we're taking on board immigrants from other countries, often countries far away from us, and we're losing, it's the classic white flight that a lot of the more right-wing thinkers on YouTube talk about. We're losing our culture because we're going abroad, and we're gaining a lot of immigrants, and you get to a point in your life where that there has to be a question mark over that. Do you know what I mean? How do you continue having your own culture and your own identity, particularly when the majority of the people in London are no longer English people? There's something wrong, very wrong there. So if this video only has the function of telling somebody who wants to go and teach abroad for years and years not to, then okay, I'm happy with that judgment. I did, and there are good points about it, but there are mostly negative points, I would say. And the reason is simple. There will be a level of fascination about you that will be charming and welcoming, and you'll feel genuine love from people, possibly. And even, obviously if you're romantically involved with anybody, but it's such a price to pay. I think the British, the Western Asian coupling, that happens, is for the few. It's not something you should enter into lightly. And of course, when you're speaking from personal experience, possibly, it's when you're 23, 24, 25, 26, you are perhaps not mature enough to understand the risks that you're taking in how much outreach you're going to have to make culturally if you do that. And for the most part, even the most open-minded Westerners are not up to that task. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth my while? Now, if you're just wanting to go away for a year and do a contract, even go back and do some other job that's nothing to do with teaching when you get back to your own country, I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't stop people from doing that, or I wouldn't be totally down on that idea. But other than that, I don't know. You'd have to either that, or you see, the other psychology you get into is the expat that just hates their own country so much and finds it so intolerable that they would rather be in a very alien culture. Perhaps they'll have 4 or 5 friends who are from similar cultures and maybe a few Korean friends. But generally, what they'll try to do, and this is not this happens everywhere, you know, this is not a terrible thing. You know, why is that they not got mixed amongst all the Koreans and have all Korean friends? Well, you know, that's a hard thing to do. I think people are very naive, and we were taught in the 90s through to the noughties that you know, it's just, it can be done, all of this stuff. And I'm kind of trying to say that it can't be. It can't. There is an extent of outreach where you can learn the language or you can have friends, and I'm specifically talking about Asia now. Like, I can't speak with somebody who's lived in Spain for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. I just don't see the level of effort that difficult. You know, you learn the Espanol and you do, and you have a social circle if you're gregarious enough for it. So that's a very different proposition. No, I'm talking about Asia, and I guess, you know, East and West is the title. So let's just kind of focus on that. That's a tough call. Do you know what I mean? Are you up for that? I know I met some people in Japan who'd been there 1/4 of a century, something like that. I don't know as many. That's interesting, actually. Even that, just comparison. I met people who've been in Japan long term, and not met as many people in Korea long term. But you know, I still know people who've been there over a decade, maybe something like that. I know people now who moved to Korea in the late 90s, so you know, that's a fair while. Um, yeah, if you just want some experience of another country, and and you're willing to put in the effort for the language as well, because most people don't, and that's another big issue. I mean, I never did enough, really, but learn it in advance. If you really want to do it, learn it in advance. I mean, you've got things on the internet now. You can learn languages so quickly now. Um, Learn basic vocab, learn basic conversation. You can have it down pat before you even end up in the country. That's what I would do now. Um, Otherwise, be in for a rough ride if you haven't got many qualifications, because everything's gone qualification crazy as the years have gone by. So, for example, it was a degree in anything in 2003 that you could probably get a teaching job with. Um, Whether I intended it or not, over the years I ended up with a master's and a degree and a teaching certificate on top of that. So I could go to Asia tomorrow and probably pick up a job. Not that I want to, for all the reasons that I've just mentioned, really. So you got your qualification and you want to be somewhere else for a while. Also, it's useful being abroad for a while to know who you are culturally, because suddenly you've got a distance from your culture, and when you're at a distance, then you can explicate the thing more, and you can say, well, what is my culture? What are the good things about my culture? What are the bad things? At the moment, Westerners are kind of taught that it's all bad, right? And I'm here to say it isn't. I think live in Japan or live in Asia for 15 years and come back and tell me the West is horrible or there's not something to preserve. I think there's an immense amount to preserve. I mean, just the cultural history, you know, the architecture. You know, I saw this, what is it, last year? Santa di Croce, Florence, what is it, the Basilica, York Minster, you know, certain churches of England and Europe, cathedrals. I'm not a religious person in that way very much, but come on, I mean, maybe came out of usurious means of finance, which we can't do anything about now. But these things are immense, immense. Go to South Korea and try to find something architecturally as intricate and genuinely, soulfully beautiful as some of these things in Europe. I'm sorry, there are lots of nice temples, and there's lots of things been destroyed in Korea, unfortunately. But, just don't tell me they understand what beauty is. They don't. They really don't. And we do. I think we've got this is where I become a bit more of a supremacist. We've got the goods on beauty when it comes to art and architecture and poetry and music. We've just got a lot of that going on. And what you don't understand when you're 22 and you hate Manchester, you hate the city that you're from, or whatever it is, it's only later you'll come back to it with fresh eyes and you'll see certain things that are really brilliant about it. And with that, I'm just going to grab myself some water. Hold on a second. So, this is a thing that you need to learn, perhaps, to go, if you're in Asia for 1 or 2 years. It gives you time. This is one of the benefits of, say, a shorter length of time. Is that, hold on. It gives you time to find out what your culture is, some kind of distance, perhaps distance from your family or your friends. You can look at it from a wider perspective, hopefully. So that's what I think could be beneficial if you're just there for a shorter time. If you're there for a long time, immersion, what I would say, really getting ensconced with the thing to the degree that maybe you only have a couple of foreign friends and most of your daily conversation is in another language. I mean, there were months that went by where I didn't speak English to anybody towards my last 5 years. Because the other thing is, if you're dealing with other Westerners, they come and go, right? So if you want friends for a longer time, you have to try to find friends amongst the natives, as it were. And I'm not using that as a badge of whatever. I'm just saying that's what happened. So I don't really mind. I don't think of people that way. Sorry, I shouldn't be smoking on camera, but I wanted to do a longer video, and this is one way of thinking. It's my one bad habit, which I am going to quit eventually. So I've given you some comparisons between Japan and Korea, and perhaps I should go into that a little bit more. Korea has suffered with the Korean War itself, but it's also suffered despots and tyrants to a degree that Britain has not. We have inept lunatics, and I do believe very vociferously now that we have a world conspiracy on our hands and have done for centuries. But in terms of the immediate problems, South Korea's had a bunch of, I'll go into one example in a minute, but it's basically had decades of outright military interference in people's lives in some stages of the last half century. And even the average South Korean who's young will not be told about any of this stuff in school. The schools are censored, and they are just as lunatic as the Western schools. Okay, to get around to my example though, I would know about this specifically because it was specific to Gwangju, which is probably the 5th largest city in South Korea for people who don't know the country. It's in the southwest corner. Interestingly, as you go north in England, people are more friendly and open-minded and critical of the government, I would say. That's why all these lockdowns are tending to occur in the north. That's what I would argue. Comparatively, it's the south where you have the dissent, I think, in South Korea. So the south of South Korea. So, for example, Gwangju is in the southwest corner. Busan, the major port, the second biggest city, is in the southeast corner. Those are the two places where dissent ferments, and it's no accident, I think, that they've never had a high-speed train link between those two cities in the south. Because if those guys start talking to each other, God knows what would happen to Seoul. So that's something to consider if you don't know the geography of South Korea and you're interested in politics. Back to Gwangju. Gwangju suffered what they call, what they politely call in South Korea, people who are trying to advance themselves, as an uprising. And people who want to tell you the truth will say it was a massacre. And what happened was in 1980, a guy named Chon Do-wan, who was basically a military leader stroke leader, he was not anything of a leader as far as I can tell, sent the military into Gwangju because there were too many protests against the government of the time. And these were student protests. You can go and look it up, the Gwangju Massacre, Gwangju Uprising. You'll see lots of pictures about it. Actually, one of the first public events I took part in when I was in Gwangju was a memorial. It was the May 18th memorial. This happened on May the 18th, 1980. It's very famous. What happened was students went into the centre of Gwangju and they were confronted with the military, and the military wiped out about 200 of them. The numbers have always been sketchy. We don't know. Some say 100, some say 200, and they've got a horrific memorial site that looks like something out of Stalin's wet dream as the memorial site for the Gwangju Uprising. I don't know whoever got away with that one. But I mean, I could do a specific video on this one event, but it's just typical of the total lack of respect for their own people the South Korean government has had in the past. Having said that, there have been in more recent times good things that have happened. Better things happen politically in South Korea than in England. England is a cesspool of idiots and lunatics and has been for centuries as far as I can tell. Whereas it seems to me when people are totally oppressed, then there's some kind of spark of opposition occurs. So you do get people rising in politics that are vaguely sensible, even though I would say the overarching draconian angle of the thing, or conspiratorial angle, has probably been pretty much undisturbed. There have been better leaders in South Korea in the last 50 years than there have been in Britain. I would say that pretty much categorically. I would say the leader that South Korea had concomitant to Barack Obama was a guy named Lo Moo-hyun, and he was still in the conglomerate of lawyers and idiots that we have in Britain as well. But he did some really good things, and I think I've even presented one of my videos wearing one of his t-shirt devoted to his memory. But he died in suspicious circumstances, surprise, surprise. And apparently he was getting a lot of media flack at the time, which is similar to an American leader of late, no? And he decided to jump off a hill in his hometown in the southeast of South Korea. I don't buy that for a second. I think he'd gone too far, and they had to get rid of him. For the conspiratorialists amongst you, I'll try and give you a link to his memorial site, personal memorial site, and it's the shape of a pyramid, which is interesting. I did actually put a load of links when this happened, or in the years following this happening. I think it happened in 2012-ish. I'll get the details and I'll put them in the commentary underneath. Anyway, that's interesting. But he was a good guy, I think, and he was trying to do good things. I don't know enough because I've been out of South Korea recently. I don't know enough about the most recent leader. He was coming up for possibly being elected as I was leaving. I think he was elected in a few months after I left in 2017, maybe earlier. I can't remember because I was out of the country for a while and then back in 2017. Anyway, I don't know much about him. Some people say he's a good one, but I couldn't give you any details. I will say though Mushon was a fairly good leader, and he was really disturbing people in Seoul, which is what the aim of the game is, as far as I can tell. So that's that. Most people who live in South Korea, if they're foreigners, don't analyse these things too heavily. I have one guy who's been a Facebook contact for years, Zane Ivy, who posts vaguely sane and interesting and insightful things about the culture. I don't know if he's still there. I think he was in Seoul when I knew of him years ago. I think he's still in the country. So yeah, it's good to get in touch with seasoned expats living in South Korea, because they'll tell you something about the socio-political makeup of the place. Yeah, so that all fascinates me. And the Koreans have a spirit that is lacking, or has been lacking, in Britain up until Brexit, I would say. But this is my own personal politics coming out now, and I'll get onto that kind of stuff in other videos. But yeah, I'm in some ways I'm positive about some aspects of South Korean politics. Not that impressed with British politics up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I'll get into that in other videos. But yeah, I like that about Koreans. They're fighters, you know. And if you have a bad day, they actually use the English. There's a weird kind of Englishism that they use, fighting, you know, which is if you have a bad day, they go fighting, which is like, cheer up, you know, everything will be all right. Which is charming, if a little bit repetitive after 13, 14 years. So they have that spirit, you know, and I want to make a video about immigration, and I'll try to talk more about, I'll use some of my experience of Asia in that video as well. So they're just cursorily, they're not really at the stage that the West is at by any means, obviously. The Japanese are really kind of anti-immigration in many ways. The Koreans probably instinctually are similar, but they might not have as much knowledge about the West so that they can counter what might be happening in terms of immigrant numbers. So that's that. I think there's a lot of clued in people, maybe, in that respect. Not a lot, but there's a good minority of people who are paying attention to things like that. And they did have the Asian Union, business union, that they kiboshed a few years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it was something akin to, you know, our League of Nations, and then all of those stupid fucking think tank stroke economic templates that we've all suffered from since Versailles. So, what else do I want to say? One thing, the few regrets that I have about South Korea is it has a lot of dolmens and ancient megalithic sites which I didn't get to see, which if I went back to Korea for any length of time I would try to create some kind of tour, because I've become a lot more interested in these ancient stones and stuff like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think South Korea or Korea has more megalithic sites than anywhere else in the world. I might be wrong, but I think I've read that somewhere. So that's interesting. Other interesting things that I wish I'd have studied a bit more, which is if you go to South Korea, you will come across what they call the noraebang, which is literally singing room. Any kind of, even if you go to a smaller place, the sauna and the singing room are the first indications of social civilization. But and I only mention them peripherally. My point is that they have a form of folk singing there. I'll try to get the name of it. I've forgotten for the moment. That's interesting. Like long folk epics sung, sometimes accompanied, often unaccompanied, by singers who are trained for decades in a certain kind of singing. That fascinates me. I've listened to a few CDs of it and stuff like that. It's incredibly expensive to see live performances. God knows if there's any of them going on now. So there are corners of an immense tradition that you can focus on. Shamanism to a degree. Fortune telling is a much bigger thing than it is even in the West. It's something that you'll see a little, usually a big umbrella, usually a multicolored umbrella on a beach or in a town, or a little, even just a shack, or a little somebody just sitting on a collapsible chair in front of like a plastic table, and they'll give fortune, they'll read your fortune. I've had a couple of those. One was using tarot, I think, I can't remember, and maybe a couple of other ones. So they're really into fortune telling and stuff like that, which interests me. Shamanism to a degree, but there's not that many scholars working on the shamanic tradition of Korea. There should be more. I don't know if somebody like Mircea Eliade has encompassed his studies of shamanism. That would be from a long way back, from the 40s or whatever. So there were those elements which I'm more interested in about South Korea. But like I say, there's a lot of problems, and there's a lot of hangovers from Japanese colonialism. Something that I worry about, because I'm a Brit who feels himself to be Irish also. There's a great hatred of the Japanese in Korea, more so than the Irish towards the British in Ireland, really. But even then, there are prejudices in Ireland, as there would be for an Irishman living in Britain, I would imagine. Less so now than there would be in the past, I would imagine. But stupidity is everywhere, so that's a shame. That's hard to get over though, because specific things have happened to specific people, and there's a lot of forgiveness involved and all the rest of it. I'll speak about my experiences of prejudices in Ireland in another video, but it's horrific in the case of South Korea. And I've sat down. There's a drink. I used to be. Well, I was a big drinker. I've quit for this year, or much of this year. There's an alcoholic drink, a rice drink called makgeolli, and I remember this would be circa 2012, 11, maybe 2011. I was on an artist residency. There was a little cooperative that I did get involved in, so I'm kind of going against my generalization that there's no arts. There is arts, but it's very low key and poorly funded. So I was on this residency for a while. But the good thing that came out from that residency was that you would meet Gwangju artists who had been involved in the uprising I just mentioned, the massacre in 1980, and had been imprisoned and tortured and on all of these things that the British particularly have no notion of in our recent past or even in our more long-term past. So there's that side of it as well. So you're talking to people who have been locked in prisons and been tortured for their feelings about this, that, and the other. The funny thing about that is that, as with China, democracy movements tend to be the things that the authorities clamp down on most heavily. I'm actually not that enamoured of democracy now that I've kind of studied politics over decades, but in that form it seems respectable or noble in some ways, but I think the knowledge, maybe because there's a lack of spiritual knowledge there as well, it's not something that for me I'm that interested in much anymore. It seems to me that democracy is a stage. I've never been able to totally make the hero, the great man theory fit with the educated majority theory. There are ideas in the majority of populations that could be brilliant, and I hate to use the word Trump here, but I've not really been enamoured of what the majority can do for any given culture, really. But the great man theory is a bit tricky as well, because he's going to have total opposition from birth till death. I mean, the artist is one form of the great man, but the political thinker is somebody who has to battle so much harder in the public sphere than the artist does. So I've never been able to make those two ideas of who changes cultures, two templates for who changes cultures, the 51%, or the man with the great ideas who wants to go slowly and change people's minds over time, possibly over a whole lifetime, maybe take 40, 50 years. So idiotic is the public mind in general. Yeah, I don't know. What was I saying in relation to the East about that? Yeah, I can't make it cohere, but I mentioned that democracy was the kind of movement against authoritarian governments generally in Asia and in very much so in South Korea in recent times. I don't know what's going to happen in the future though, because we're living in we do have the global village technologically now, so that the educated Korean could be thinking beyond democracy even, and being more specific about very good political thinkers that they can read about and study, and perhaps come up with different templates for like cultural change that they couldn't have done 20 years ago. So that there's something there, whether any given populace is really able to force any useful cultural change in that way, I don't know. I mean, obviously with my thinking at the moment, it would be a traditionalist vision of the future in some ways, and then different areas of mysticism or spirituality, not the co-opted ones, and there's a lot of those on the internet as well. So it's a minefield, as it always is for Westerner and Easterner alike. But I think generally speaking, it's going to take. I would stay with my statement earlier, which is that it's not going to be in a position to provide any kind of visionary template for cultural change in the form of one leader or another. On a conspiratorial level, could it, unless people understood the monogram aspect of conspiracy, interrelated families and whatnot. I am pretty much a believer in that as well. So I don't know. I haven't spoken to Koreans who have a lot of knowledge in the area of global political conspiracies or whatever. So maybe there's some knowledge there as well. Anyway, I've tried to give you a broad template of my experiences. I know that I haven't focused on the more everyday aspects too much, and there's already loads of videos that you can look at in that way. I haven't spoken about kimchi, spiced cabbage or whatever. There is some really good food actually in Korea. Some of my favourite food in the world is in Korea. As I mentioned in another video, I've gone veggie in the last few years, so I don't think I could live in Korea because it's just up to its armpits in pork and beef. Well, beef, but pork very much so. I imagine if you were Jewish, you'd have a hell of a time. A real strict on your diet. Yeah, you'd have a hell of a time. There's a lot of meat in Korea, but there's lots of there are veggie things that you can have, and they're just really good cooks, generally speaking, and they really take care about their food. I still think that, and I'm speaking home cooking now. Home cooking is the best. It always was, and always will be. Whether this knowledge will get passed down, because I think it's that crux point where there's a split between the generations now, so that there's generations alive in Korea where they can make things like kimchi and it's stored above their houses and it takes time to ferment and all the rest of it. Whether that will get passed down is a big question now. So up until now, I would say the food is really genuine and good. Now, that's a different statement with the home cooking to the restaurants. There are certain problems if you're interested in diet. So, for example, there are big problems with how rice has been manufactured and prepared, and all of the corporate forms of rice that you buy in the most of them in the supermarket are bad for you because they've had sugar and God knows what put into them. So you have to be very careful about, and of course rice is the staple, so I'm just using that as an example. If you want to eat really well on good food, you still have to be careful in a supermarket, but probably less careful than you'd have to be in a Western supermarket. I will go into other things like health in Korea in other videos. All I'll say right now is that I'm more respectful of independent clinics than I am of any hospital system. I have a certain amount of toleration of accident and emergency, broken bones, stuff like that, but I think basically the hospital system in the West is totally corrupt and they push all kinds of garbage. It's interesting to see the hydroxychloroquine, is it, being wheeled out. That's interesting, but I think generally most people who are in politics, or even people who just give health advice in the media, are utterly useless. Korea is interesting because I think that you have an indigenous sense. People are interested in medicine, and those things have flourished over the decades because of genuine expertise. And now, with industrialization in Korea, it's been compromised by this encroachment of a hospital system on the template of the West that's sat in the culture alongside the independent clinics that have the true knowledge. Not always, but a lot of the time. There's still a lot of good health advice and health cures you can get from independent clinics in South Korea. I would recommend them way more than any hospital. And also, unfortunately, their system is more based on the US system. So you have to have insurance and all the rest of it. I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately. I'm not sure about that. That's another question I have in my mind. Like, should you pay? I think I don't have a problem with the privatization of health service. The problem is that everybody's so poor in England that no independent clinic can rise too high, and for you to have affordable medicine. Some people say that privatization is just because it's a hangover from the Thatcher era. That's like a terrible word that you can't use, and you can't just have a private clinic with good expertise and that being a kosher operation. I think that's absolutely fine. That is almost like the market deciding its own purpose, and one of those public needs is health. So when I look at somewhere like South Korea, when I look at British health, I look with my experience from South Korea. So I can see that expertise will have left this culture that I was brought up in way before I was born. Any expertise in health, I would imagine, disappeared at the end of the 19th century or early 20th century, and then it was replaced by this NHS monstrosity. I'm not of the ilk of somebody that would say it's something that we need to save. I think it should be obliterated or utterly reconfigured on the manager level, on the local management level, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So good, it's good Korea in that sense, but the question then becomes: do the South Koreans now, who are growing up in their 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, see that? Because if they don't, that clinic system, that clinic, not even a system, that sense of having the private clinic and the private doctor as being useful, if those generations coming up now don't see that, then you're going to have a system, in a health service stroke system in place, which will be another monogram for the culture on an international template, and that's all negative as far as I can tell. And then you'll get problems coming up, diabetes, you'll get other long-term illnesses, cancers, and all the rest of it. They've already got the bad food coming in, as I say now. They're just a little bit further down the road than we are in our kind of catastrophic cultures in the West. So yeah, that's interesting. Compare. If you're in South Korea, go to a clinic. Have $100 or the equivalent. If you have a minor health problem, and you have $100 or the equivalent saved up, go to a clinic. Go to a clinic. You'll be spending money anyway. It's just that you'll get a discount from your teaching insurance in the hospital. You won't get anything like that in a clinic, to my knowledge. But it's worth it because you'll probably get some decent advice, and you'll also come across, hopefully, an individual that actually gives a toss about you on a personal level. I always found when I was in a clinic in South Korea, they ask you personal questions like, do you have a lot of stress in your life? What you're doing from week to week? They take an interest in you as an individual. The NHS in Britain don't do that. It's ticked boxes, and I've got somebody else coming in this room in 20 minutes, so please just give me the data and be on your way. I never felt that in a Korean clinic. So like I say, there are probably bad ones and good ones, but have that experience if you do have a minor health problem, to compare notes. Depends on if you're connected to a school, they'll recommend you. The school will usually recommend a hospital. So just be aware of that, and maybe they don't have the knowledge. But obviously, linguistically, you need to be speaking to somebody who's got some English, or you've got some Korean, or you've got somebody who can translate for you, to glean what you need to glean from a clinic. Inevitably, a clinic, you won't get English speakers as much. It's a classic internationalist perspective with the hospitals. So that might be a little bit worrying for you, but I wouldn't worry, because I still think the best advice is there. Our systems have been wiped out over the years. Some of it's coming back with the internet now. But anyway, that's another video on health. I think I've done justice to this topic anyway. Hopefully, East and West. Probably just giving you more East than West, but it's something that will filter into other videos, because that's my experience, and I've had a lot of experiences of Asia. So I would like to do a more broad presentation on Eastern philosophy, for example. Tends to be a bit exotic in the West, and we just get thrown all of these sages and philosophers, and I'd like to be a bit more critical and make a video about that as well, if you're interested. Okay, that's pretty much all of my observations on East and West for today, and I'll make some similar videos soon. Okay, take care, bye.